So, a few months ago, I put together a video on how to get this floating IKEA Besta TV unit installed for only 2/3 the price. And while it's generated tons of positivity throughout its several 100,000 viewings, I also received a few comments that were, let's just say, less than complimentary, many of which have to do with me not aligning the hinge adjustments on the doors. And to tell the truth, when I put together the first video for this project, my main goal was to share how I was able to get this on the wall for significantly less than the cost of the packaged install. And just trying to convey all that info amounted to what felt like a pretty lengthy video. But so many of the commenters made me realize that getting the doors on there in a way that is totally uniform, like you see here, is perhaps not that intuitive of a process. So for today's video, I thought I'd go over how each hinge adjustment works, as well as share a few tricks that will help you get both pieces hung on the wall to the exact same height and depth, even with one being hung on IKEA's suspension rail and the other one being anchored directly into the studs. And the best thing about this video is that you can make these adjustments no matter where you are in the installation process, as I went ahead and squared up all 4 door gaps on mine, after it had already been on the wall for several months. But before we get too deep into the details, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. But not if you have a money allergy. I know there are probably a few people out there allergic to money who absolutely hate this channel. So if your seasonal money allergies are beginning to flare up and you couldn't bear the idea of saving a few dollars, do not, I repeat, do not hit that subscribe. Okay, so we first need to grab some measurements in order to determine how far apart we're going to be spacing each door. This is going to allow us to accurately dial in our width adjustment a little later. I'm first measuring the 3 cabinets on the right, which comes out to approximately 70 7/8, whereas the 2 cabinets on the left combine for a width of 47 1/4 inch. When we add that together, we end up with 118 1/8. But wait, there's one more step before we get our actual length. You see, at the point where our 2 pieces come together, given the way that IKEA has manufactured this, the top part on either one doesn't quite sit flush with the sides. If you look real closely here, you can see what I'm talking about. Even if you can screw the sides up right next to each other like these, you'll still want to plan for a slight gap. So if we round up our overall measurement to 118 1/4, we can begin to do some back-of-the-envelope math. Once we determine our door length, which, lucky for us, comes out to an easy 23 1/2 inches. Since we're putting 5 doors on this thing, we can multiply to get our combined door length of 117 1/2 inches, which ends up being just 3/4 inch shy of our overall length. Now, if we take a look at the front, we can see that there are 4 different areas where the doors meet, which means we would have to adjust our hinges to create a 3/16 gap at each of those 4 locations in order to make up for that 3/4 of an inch difference. That is, of course, assuming that we hang both of the outside doors, even with the ends of the fixture like you see here. Now, regardless of whether you put in a set of standard hinges with a cabinet damper like me, or opted for one of these soft clothes options that I recommended to save a few more dollars, you are going to have 3 basic points of adjustment on your hinges. The first of which is this screw that controls the width. Screwing this in and out allows us to change the space between the front of the doors in order to get that uniform 3/8 gap across the front. If you've hung the doors close to level with the top of the unit, you'll just need to screw these in or out a few turns to get that gap to look right. Once you've got your 4 gaps as close to uniform as possible, you can move on to getting the depth adjustment the same on all the doors. A good way to eyeball this is to just take a look down the length of the unit and see if you can get about the same width on this straight line along the top here. As you can see, my second door in from the right needs to be adjusted about a fraction of an inch or so, so I'm unscrewing the depth screw on each of the hinges and then pulling it just ever so slightly away from the wall. Once you've got it to about where you think it needs to be, go ahead and tighten up those screw heads, and then take another look down your line. You can also check the lower edges of the doors to make sure none are sticking out, and if they are, rinse and repeat until you get a totally uniform depth across the front of all 5. Keep in mind, though, that if you can't get both units anchored fairly close to the exact same depth on the wall, that top line is going to look like a dog's breakfast. If you take a look at this footage before I adjusted the units, you can see how jagged things look if you get your doors in line without having the cabinets flush with one another. How I ended up fixing this was first removing our countersunk wood screws that we had holding these together, then loosening up the cabinet on the right just a bit where it's screwed into the studs, And then finally sliding some composite shims behind that metal piece that IKEA provides. With the depth between the two now more or less uniform, we just have to tighten our connection into the studs, and then once again countersink our screws back into the sidewalls while holding the front of the cabinet up to the same height as the one next to it. You can also stick a shim between the base of the cabinet and the wall to really dial in the height on the front of them before tightening things down. Now, as far as the height adjustment goes, I basically just hung all the doors as close as possible to the top of the frames and then used the hardware that anchors into the cabinet itself to slide them up or down where needed. If you're using these Hozom soft close hinges that I recommended, you should know that they actually come with a separate screw to make this part of the process even easier. So I hope that sharing how some of these finer adjustments work will help you get your unit looking at least as good as the one you see here. And if you've made it this far, please consider hitting that like button or subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. And hopefully I'll see you next time. Thanks.